Certainly had a great afternoon today. Got a little bit of rest. I had some good fellowship at lunch, and certainly good to be back together in worship and praise and adoration of God tonight. You know, it's been just over 2 weeks now that a gunman went into a denominational church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, killing 25 people and then ultimately turning the gun on himself later. And in the aftermath of that church shooting, the world seems to have moved on now, just a few news cycles away, and we're no longer talking about it. We've seen politics and scandals and sports and all kinds of things that have cropped up on our radar in the news cycle, but this one seems to be fading into the distance. And today, while those members of that church are putting their lives back together, are honoring their dead. I don't know if you saw the tribute that they paid to those who were slain in the services there, but it was very moving. And all the while, politicians and pundits and commentators and those who are in the know have used this as an impetus for another debate on gun violence. And there are those who are quick to point out and say what we need to do is make buying a gun much harder than it is. And then there are others who counter and say, no, we need to enforce the laws which we have on the books. Then there are others who point in other countries in the world where guns in the hands of private citizens are unheard of, and they say we need to have a society where private citizens do not have firearms. And the problem is that as they continue to offer these Band-Aid solutions, meaning they're not curing the problem, they're simply a Band-Aid that they are trying to put over the real problem, the real answer, which is there. The real answer is not something that is hard or something that is foreign. It is there, but it is ignored day in and day out. You know, many people look at America today and they begin to wonder, why is America today much more violent than, say, the America of the 1950s or the America of the 1900s? Why does America appear to be more violent today? And I suppose that there's a lot of different ideas and factors that would weigh into this perception. I think generally speaking, we are nostalgic people. And so nostalgia for the good old days. We tend to think that our childhood days were much better than today. And that every generation is that way. The old days, the old days, the old days. So much so that Solomon himself would say in Ecclesiastes, ask not wherefore are the old days better than these, because you do not inquire wisely concerning these things. I think that natural tendency to like the old days better than the current days plays into that idea that it used to be better in the United States of America. I think another factor that weighs into this perception that modern America is more violent is the speed with which communication is disseminated. When something happens, you can read it on Facebook or other social medias. It's tweeted out, it's Instagrammed, it's Snapchatted. Before long, news channels are on site and on scene. We have a 24-hour, or not just a single one, but we have several 24-hour news channels for sports or for politics or for mixed news. And so something happens and it's very quick to be right there in our faces. And something that might have gone unnoticed in Colorado because it happened in Georgia, it's like we're feeling it right here in Colorado nowadays. And then I also think that another factor here, the perception that America is more violent today than ever before, is that our pop culture industry, entertainment, movies, television, magazines, things like that, years ago, oftentimes they depicted the good things in life. You know, how do we think about the old cinema? It's a Wonderful Life and George Bailey. You know, it's depicting the very best of our humanity. And those that were not good, Mr. Potter in that particular movie, he was played as a villain, not as a hero. But today the most deviant personalities among us are the ones that are glorified and proffered as what is normal in our society. And so we are seeing more deviant behavior in our pop culture. Now, whether or not we can come to the conclusion and say that America is more violent today than it ever has been or not, I do know this. Just like in the 1950s or any era or decade of American history, as in today, murder, violence, and hate are a plague to us, and they threaten our very safety. We can agree on that. We don't have to agree on all the others, but we can definitely agree on that. The Bible says that righteousness exalts a nation, but a sin is a reproach to any people, Proverbs 14 and verse 34. And so we are seeing in our own society a move away from God, and therefore a falling away from that righteousness which exalts our nation into the sin which is a reproach to us. It has been rightly observed time and time again in history, as people are wringing their hands about gun violence, someone wisely will point out that guns don't kill people, people kill people. And when you have hate and you have violence and you have a lack of God, people will kill people, whether it's with a gun, with a knife, or with their bare hands. It's a simple fact that whenever God is not reining us in, we will do whatever we want to do. And so the real issue isn't what kind of guns are available to our population. The real question ought to be asked is, what kind of people are we producing as a society? That's going to make the difference. Not getting rid of the guns, not getting rid of knives. I mean, murder has been condemned by God for millennia before guns were even invented. It is an issue that when we turn away from God, we enter into violence and hate. And so as long as that is the case, that discussion about what is going to help us with gun violence and mass shootings and murders, as long as we're focusing on the gun, we're going to continue to have violence and mass murders and shootings. It's just a simple fact. And the secular world is afraid to have this discussion because it gets to our base character as a society. There's an old poem written in 1895. There was a leader of the temperance movement back in 1895, lived here in the United States for a little while, spent most of his life in Britain. But his name was Joseph Malins. Malins had been advocating and pushing for the abolition of alcohol. Take it out. It is the bane of our existence as a society, is that people get drunk, they commit crimes, they're throwing them in dungeons, we're scraping them off the streets. So instead of doing all this, let's go straight to the problem and deal with the alcohol. And that was his mentality. And he wrote the poem. Sometimes it's called The Ambulance Down in the Valley, and sometimes An Ambulance or a Fence. I'm not going to read the poem here. You can look it up. There's a lot of different versions of it out there. But in his particular version, it says that there's a town and there's a dangerous cliff that overlooks the valley. But the view from that cliff is spectacular. And so a lot of people go up to see the view, and as they're looking at the view, they would fall off the cliff. And the townspeople have said that, this is not good. We need to do something about all the people falling off the cliff. So there were two basic options. One group said what we need to do is put a fence up there along the cliff to keep people from falling off. And the others said, no, we need to put an ambulance down in the valley so that when they fall, we can minister to them. And of course, the ambulance down in the valley is what wins the day. And so day after day, as people would fall from the cliff, the ambulance would pick them up and take them to the infirmary and heal them. And then finally, one old wise man said, we would be better off if we would put the fence on the cliff and prevent this from happening than trying to mop up with a cure after it's finished or after it's happened. Why, he would have us do away with all of our charities if we followed his logic. We do good. Every time someone falls, we're very quick to be there and to help them out. And so the ambulance was down in the valley. And the poem illustrates the absurdity of a cure when prevention is possible. That's where we are today. When we're talking about gun control and gun violence, we're talking about a cure when prevention is possible. And while the world is debating the ambulance in the valley, brethren, we as the church, as the people of God, need to be shouting from the rooftops the fence along the cliff. That's the only hope for us. And while the secularist, the humanist, the atheist, the multiculturalist concentrate on the cure, we know where the prevention is. It's here in the Word of God. So the real question is how can we help produce better people? If it's the kind of people that is at issue here, how can we help produce better people? If you have your Bibles, turn to Psalm 36. I know it's kind of a long introduction to get to Psalm 36. Psalm 36, David, this is a psalm of David, and here David is, he shows the great chasm between the greatness of God, the righteousness of God, and the depravity of mankind, the choices that he makes. And really, this entire discussion begins with the ruler himself, God, the creator. In Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth. God formed man of the dust of the ground, Genesis 2 and verse 7, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And then in Genesis chapter 2 and verses 15 through 17, he put man in the Garden of Eden to keep it and to dress it, giving him commandments of what to do. He told him he may eat of any tree of the Garden of Eden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis chapter 3, man disobeyed. When the devil came and tempted Eve, the temptation was not just that this was food, but if you eat this food, you will become like God. The very first sin that man engages in is a sin against the character and the being and the nature of God. By eating the fruit and trying to become like God, by disobeying God himself and his direct command, it was an affront to the Father. In Genesis 4, the second sin that we read of is the sin against our fellow man. Cain rose up and slew Abel. And so man disobeyed God as the ruler. Why do people sin? Well, it is because there is no fear of God in their eyes. Paul quotes that in Romans chapter 3, verse 18. It's the end of a paragraph in which Paul quotes several series of verses from the Old Testament to prove one thing. Romans chapter 3 and verse 10, there is none righteous, no, not one. He'll come to the ultimate conclusion to a verse that we quote often, Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And the point of that verse is not actually saying that each one of us is individual sins, but that all races of people, there is no group of people that is immune from the temptation and following sin. Jew and Gentile. Of course, that was the conflict of Romans from the beginning to the end, is that conflict between Jew and Gentile Christians. And so he's saying, look, the Gentiles, in chapter 1, the Gentiles need to be careful of their sins. In chapter 2, the Jews are like, that's right, you get them, Paul. He said, but what about you, O man of God? Are you without excuse? And so he deals with common sins among the Jews. And then he comes to chapter 3 and he said, here's the deal. We've all sinned. There's none righteous, no, not one. And he follows that logic down through chapter 3 and verse 10 down to verse 18. And here's what he says. Because there is no fear of God before their eyes. God is not respected. God is not held in awe. We are not terrified by the prospect of God's judgment on our lives. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And he's quoting that from right here in Psalm 36 and verse 1. Which says, transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. When God is not feared, when God is not respected as the one who sets out the rules and the governance of life, men will do anything. They'll do whatever he wants to do. Something has to lead us. Something has to guide us. In our design as humanity, God is the figure that is to guide us. But if we eliminate God, if we erase him out of the picture, we are left with us. There's nothing higher than man. The dolphins do not dictate to us how we are to live because the dolphins are not as smart as we are. The monkeys and the apes, they do not dictate to us how we are to live and what is right and wrong, because they are not as intelligent as we are. We have intelligence and sentience and an understanding of our self-existence like no other creature on earth. And if we take anything above us out of the picture, we are left to ourselves. And that's the problem. We have spent so much time teaching in public schools, in science rooms, that you are just the product of elements coming together with some energy, mixing together over time and eventually becoming a puddle of goo, and out of the goo came an organism, and out of the organism arose more organisms, more complex organisms, until eventually we get the animals, which would lead to humanity, the highest of the animals so far. But nonetheless, you are still just an animal. And then we're told, you go, girl. You do what you want to do. You set your goal, and you don't let anybody stop you. And then, when something stands in my way, it's got to be eliminated, because there's nothing to tell me I can't do it. There's no reason to stop doing it if that's what I want to do. I think of Leviticus 19 and verse 14. It's an interesting verses. It's in chapter 19 of Leviticus is about be holy as I am holy. That's how he starts it out. And then he deals with different things that would separate man from God. And one of those things he says, you shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your Lord or your God, for I am the Lord. I'm Yahweh, he says. But notice, you shall not curse the deaf. Why would anyone be so cruel as to curse or mock a deaf person? They can't hear you, so why would you do it? Precisely because they can't hear you. Why would you put a stumbling block before the blind? Right? When I was kids, we used to talk about how Helen Keller's parents, punished her when she did badly, and they moved the furniture, stuff like that. They're putting stumbling blocks in front of her. Why would you do that to a blind person? Because you're cruel. Well, what holds us back from being such cruel kinds of people? What does he say? Fear God. When there's no fear of God before their eyes, cruelty, hatred, violence is bound up in his heart. That's the ruler. When you replace God, or when you take God out of the picture, you've got to have a replacement. And the replacement becomes mankind. It becomes us. You remember in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when the people have come to Samuel, who has been judging the nation of Israel for a generation. They said, we want a king so we can be like the nations all around us. We want to be like everybody else. And so in chapter 7 or chapter 8 and verse 7, God says to Samuel, obey the voice of the people, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. When you reject God as a ruler, you have to take man as a ruler. And so we come back here to Psalm 36, this transgression, this oracle which spoke directly to his heart. The wicked, you think about the wicked and how he just feels that transgression. He just feels the oracle. What's interesting, I didn't bring this up, but the phrase, the transgression speaks to the man, or the wicked man, it's the same formula that talks about the oracle of God or the oracle of David. It's the oracle of transgression, and it speaks to his heart. That's what happens to us, is that sin sounds so good. And we're tempted and lured away to follow it. Okay, God is gone. Now what? Verse 2. He flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. So we go back and we see in these verses that when God is rejected, he is going to be replaced by man. Man's feelings, his lusts, his thoughts, his own ideas, they become the standard for how to live life. It's been happening for generations. It was Jeremiah who would say in Jeremiah 10 and verse 23, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walks to direct his footsteps." Love the illustration of Jeremiah 10 and verse 23. Because what he's saying is that God sees more than we see. You ever seen a quilt that was just beautiful, glorious? We had an opportunity to see one. It was like 24 feet long by 12 feet tall. And it was a quilt made of half-inch squares that was Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, the painting, The Last Supper. It's beautiful. The hours, it was a dentist that did it, the hours that he put into it and piecing all the squares together and picking just the right shades and just the right colors so that when you looked at it, you saw the whole picture. It was beautiful. But as it was standing there in the stand, if you walked up to it and put your nose about this far away, do you know what you saw? A bunch of just different colored squares. You didn't see it. You couldn't see the whole thing. All you saw were maybe some dark colors and light colors and different hues, but that was it. And you couldn't make anything out of it at this close. This is how we live life. This is all we see. Man is but a few days and full of trouble, right? What is your life? It is here for a moment and then vanishes away. We see life, this much of it, just the part we live. God steps back and he sees the whole quilt. He sees the entire picture. Jeremiah says, it's not in man that sees this much to direct his footsteps. But when you can't find anything above that, when you deny that there's someone that sees the whole picture, you're left with man who sees this much to direct his footsteps. It's a sad state and commentary on life. He says of this man who has no fear of God that he ceases to act wisely. And what's interesting about that is that it shows that at one time he did walk rightly before God. He was wise, he was good, but he stopped that. Why? Because he erased God out of his picture. When we take God out, we are left to do whatever we want. He disregards God's authority and his presence, thinking, there's no one to judge what I'm about to do. He flatters himself, it says, and he thinks to himself, my iniquity will not be found out and hated. Who's going to find it out? Not God, because there's no God. Little does he realize that despite his denial of God, God continues to exist. He lies and sows discord. He acts foolishly. And without a standard then higher than man, man is bound up in evil. Evil is not rejected, it says, for mankind. So what's the result? He's replaced God with himself. Then every person is told, you can set your own path, follow your dreams, do for you, and any mitigating standard that might rein them in has been removed. People will act selfishly. They will set their own worth. They will set their own morality. They will set their own reward. And heaven help us if they are not allowed to live the way they want. And evil abounds. If you don't follow my religion, I'll kill you. If you break up with me, I'll kill you. If things don't go the way I want them to, I'll kill you. If you offend me in any way, I will kill you. People kill people because they do not fear God. And they have replaced his ultimate rule within themselves. Even earthly governments cannot rein it in. Oh, we'll outlaw it. We'll make it wrong to kill someone. Unfortunately, morality legislated by the land does not replace the standard of morality when it comes from God, a fear of his awesome power. The message of our modern society that we are just animals bumping along living this life and doing whatever we want to do, it has been a detriment to our lives. The supreme moral authority of God is rejected, and each person must then set their own moral code. And in the end, all you have to do is listen to your heart and follow your dreams. Do you see the trouble that we're getting into? Those seem very innocuous. Follow your dreams. What if my dream is to shoot up a movie theater? Follow your dreams. If you do that, you'll go to jail. That's not much of a deterrent. You do that, you'll be punished to an eternity of hell and torment. And all of a sudden, it becomes a little more of a deterrent. When we glorify violence and hate and greed, and we warp man's created purpose of goodness and righteousness into something that is monstrous, animalistic, and focused on self. So what do? What's the rollback? It's restore the fear of God in the hearts and lives of people. Do not settle for less than God's ways. Look at the next verses in the passage, starting in verse 5. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your love is an expanse as far as the eye can see. Your faithfulness, your dependability, your attitude toward us that we would be saved, that is, it extends to the clouds. We cannot touch the clouds, but there it is for God. Or your righteousness is like the mountains, O God. They're insurmountable. They're impregnable. God, your righteousness cannot be destroyed. It cannot be brought down. Your judgments are like the great deep, unfathomable. We go and we search out the deeps, and we keep searching and keep searching and keep searching, but the righteousness of God, the goodness of God, the judgments of God are so deep and profound they are past our finding out, as the Bible says. Man and beast you save, O God. Your salvation is reserved for the creature because you are that creator. Now compare this description of God and his greatness with man and his ways, which compared to the depths of God's judgment and equity and fairness become like a shallow marshland, a cesspool, as it were, of thoughts and ideas compared to God. You have God in his highness on one side, and you have man in his extreme lowness on the other side, and we are caught in between them. We teach people, do not settle for anything less than what God's greatness is. Secondly, he goes from the immensity of God to the intimacy of God, beginning in verse 7. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights, for with you is the fountain of life, and in your light do we see light. You see, God is not just this immense force that is greater than all that we think or ask, but God is also this intimate power with us, that he embraces this intimacy with us. The personal relationship with God is seen in how precious his blessings are, the refuge that he offers, the food and the drink in his house, and the light that he gives. And then we prayerfully, fervently seek for God's way to prevail, verses 10 through 12. Oh, continue your steadfast love. It's interesting. He's already mentioned God's steadfast love in its immensity, God's steadfast love in its intimacy, and now it's God's steadfast love in its continuation with us. Continue your steadfast love to those who know you, your righteousness to the upright of heart. Let not the foot of the arrogant come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. There the evildoers lie fallen. For the third time, this steadfast love is called upon from God. And he says, there, in that moment, the wicked lie fallen. What I love about that is that there's such full confidence in God's power to save, in God's power to direct, and in God's power to protect us, that the evil, he has confidence, the evildoer will lie fallen. He will be vanquished. God will prevail. How do we restore? Well, we restore by accepting God's ways, by embracing an intimacy of a relationship with him, and praying for his victory. If we do not live under the fear of God, we will never convince our neighbors to live under the fear of God. That's really what it comes down to. If we're going to help the world produce better people, it begins with me. It begins with my righteousness and my fear of God. Peace and victory over conflict. It begins small and it spreads from heart to heart. Peace is not something imposed upon us as a group. Peace is something that we begin with our relationship with God. It permeates my life. It is contagious and it envelops those around me closest to me so that it envelops their lives. And then it reaches to my further neighbors and further neighbors and further neighbors. But it begins right here in my heart. It must overcome that me, myself, and I mentality that is so prevalent in our world. Because leaving that harsh, selfish, I don't care what other people think about what I'm doing thing. See, that's what we hear all the time. I don't care what people think about me. We're saying that my way is as good as anybody else's way. And if I want to hurt, murder, kill, mass shoot, whatever I want to do, it's as good as what anyone else has an idea of doing. Until we recognize there is a higher standard of morality, that is God. Guns are not the people. Brethren, selfish people are the problem. Guns are not the problem. Selfish people are the problem. And so our challenge to live selflessly and let God have his place of ruling in my life. I know it's a long discussion, but that's the one that we need to be having with ourselves and with our family, with our friends, and with the world. And while everyone else is trying to decide what kinds of guns and how many guns and how to sell guns and all these other things, we need to remind them that the problem is not the gun, it's the people. Tonight, if you're separated from God, maybe you're one of those people that have been living a somewhat peaceful life, but you're not following God's way. Now's the time to change. If God is not the standard, it's just a matter of time before you make the wrong decision. But tonight you can make the right decision by coming to him while we stand and while we sing.